So I would like to offer a few thoughts in about 10 minutes relating to the overall theme of this workshop. And, I want to preface this by saying that, right now in my own department and in the program in planning at the University of Toronto, Department of Geography and Planning, we are conducting a program review, including a thorough examination of our curriculum. And this has been prompted by recent events in this part of the world, particularly the violence against Black and Indigenous people, and some of the mobilizations against, these forms of violence that we have witnessed over the last 4 years, the killing of particularly the police violence against Black people and Indigenous people in Canada. So our students have actually made the demand for us to thoroughly re-examine our own pedagogical and teaching practices, including the form and content of our curriculum, to make sure that we respond to these forms of colonial and racist and other forms of injustice by addressing our own intellectual and pedagogical practices to begin with. Of course, these are bigger problems, but we can start with what we do. So, the questions that you are raising in this workshop are very much current, and we are kind of like all of yesterday. Actually, I was on a 6-hour Zoom meeting with our faculty, examining all the syllabi, the reading lists and so on of our program, identifying, where we could improve, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, and so on and so forth. So in this sense, I'm very excited to, participate and learn from the kind of workshop that you have organized. And but I want to, in my remaining, 7 minutes or so, I want to raise a few questions, because there are some things I think, people who are generally, let's say, on the left, have no problem agreeing about, and that is to say, we need more voices from the oppressed and marginalized and exploited groups, in our work. And this means also, in the Euro-American kind of context that most of us, I guess, work in, we need better representation from, from the world outside of the Euro-American institutional matrix. And so that we are better able to register the dynamics of colonialism, imperialism, and related forms of global and systemic powers. So but it is also important to approach, this kind of task and challenge from a radical perspective. So this is the point that I want to emphasize in several ways in my initial remarks, because at one level, at a very obvious level, it seems quite uncontroversial to say that we need diversity and broader representation. Right? In fact, it is hard to find anyone who will seriously disagree with this kind of idea, and it and this kind of proposal does not really represent, in its very basic and most obvious form, any serious threat to liberal pluralism, right? So my first kind of proposal to consider in these kinds of discussion is to ask seriously how decolonial and other kinds of radical agendas can go beyond, mere liberal pluralism, which, the existing kind of, global capitalism is more than happy to welcome. And it can live with this kind of pluralism without any problem, right? So so that is sort of my first and perhaps the most important point. And but I want to kind of elaborate this with a couple of particular, references that I find useful in thinking through, some of the challenges in that we confront when we really think about what decolonizing the curriculum or the university means in this present global conjuncture of imperialism and global capitalism. So, among other forms of oppression, of course, so the and I also should emphasize that, I approach these questions not only from my current position as a academic in a northern university, but also with some respect to, my own kind of upbringing in Sri Lanka and my experiences of having grown up in Sri Lanka and having studied architecture and has actually practiced architecture and planning, and having also been politicized actually before I became an academic, in my undergraduate sort of years, in a very violent and contested and intense political context in Sri Lanka in the 1980s. So I have grown up, with these kinds of questions very much in the air. And so before I became an academic, I was sensitized even in my teenage years, I suppose, to these problems of imperialism and colonialism, right? And but also nationalism, which also means, of course, and here my kind of South Asian background is important to underline, because I see this sort of because there's a lot of discussion that we ought to have about critiquing Eurocentrism, and Western imperialism in particular. But one has to also ask and consider seriously, what forms of critiques of the West or Europe are truly radical, because not all forms are automatically or by default, radical and emancipatory. And, coming from, a place like Sri Lanka, but also knowing, in various ways, the situation in the South Asian subcontinent, I think that, there are certain forms of nationalism that we have to be vigilant about, right? So the kinds of nationalism that we see with in India, in the current, Hindu nationalist government there, or the singular nationalism in Sri Lanka, about which I have also written. In fact, my Vega presentation 2 years ago was about single Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka, right? And so when we criticize the West and Europe, it is not simply sufficient to have alternative voices. We need to also ask, what is the nature, of our critique of the West, right? Is this like a merely nationalist, identitarian, kind of a critique that is simply an inverse, of the, Western cultural hegemony. And, so, or, is it a truly emancipatory kind of a discourse, right? Or a politics? So these are important questions to answer as well. So I think my initial 10 minutes are almost taken up now. So let me, so I think, in some of the discussion concerning the, in relation to the papers, I will be able to elaborate, on some of these points, because the papers actually lend themselves to these discussions very nicely, I thought. But I would like to very briefly mention, 3 or 4 things that, have certainly very strongly influenced me in thinking through some of these questions. One is, of course, the work of Frantz Fanon, who in that famous chapter in The Wretched of the Earth, named Pitfalls of National Consciousness, I think, warned us prophetically about some of these questions from early, from the 60s, at a time when, anti-colonial nationalisms had this internationalist, approach, right, to human emancipation, rather than a purely nationalist one. And then at the same time, I also want to point to you this book by the great Fanon scholar Atto Seki Oto, right? And so there's a book called Left Universalism, Africa-Centric Essays. And he wrote, of course, earlier a classic book on Fanon called The Dialectics of Fanon's Dialectic of Experience. But here in this book, he defends universalism from a Southern, perspective, right? And particularly from an Africa-centric perspective, right? So I think this is something that has been extremely important for my kind of perspective. And another book written by my friend from my grad school days, Priyamvada Gopal, who's now a professor of post-colonial literature at Cambridge University in England, and this is called Insurgent Empire, right? And this is an extremely important book, I think, for these discussions, because what she argues, I mean, these are very, I can't adequately summarize this book in a few minutes, but what she argues is that these ideas of radical ideas of emancipation are not exclusively European products. People from around the world have made seminal and pioneering and absolutely central contributions to these ideas, against slavery, against colonialism, right? And also for socialism. So as Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, the radical geographer, is often fond of pointing out, Marxism in the 20th century has actually largely been a third world project, so it is important to underline and register the contributions of, from around the world, not only from the Euro-American world, to radical political ideas, right? And this is absolutely essential if we are to think about radical politics from an internationalist, what I would call a universalist perspective, rather than from a merely particularist and nationalist perspective, which should unfortunately, risk imitating, this clash of civilizations idea, that is obviously imperialist and a Eurocentric one, in a kind of a perverse inversion of the same logic, right? And finally, my own advisor, Susan Buck-Moss, the great Walter Benjamin and Frankfurt School scholar, wrote a very influential paper in 2000, around 2000, published in Critical Inquiry named called Hegel and Haiti, right? Where she made a case for considering the Haitian Revolution as one of the more as a absolutely central historical event, in the history of human emancipation that has traditionally been neglected and marginalized in Eurocentric forms of scholarship, including scholarship of Hegel. But in making the argument, she, like Otto Sekiotu, in his book Left Universalism, defends the idea of universal history, right? Or what I would call like the traditional left, classical left socialist idea of internationalism, right? So I want to, signpost, Otto Sekiotu's Left Universalism, Priyambada Gopal's Insurgent Empire, Susan Buckmoss's Hegel and Haiti as indispensable resources for serious consideration of decolonizing our work. So I'll end there, and we can get into more detailed discussions in the commentaries on the papers. Thank you.